I'm Morgan Blackwell, and this is the story of how my own family tried to cut me out of my inheritance, not realizing I'd already secured my grandfather's legacy. It started with whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Secret. Meetings I wasn't invited to, and the name Meridian Enterprises that kept appearing in documents that mysteriously disappeared whenever I came around. My family wasn't just planning to exclude me from the will. They were scheming to erase my entire connection to my grandfather's empire. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. I didn't fall apart when I discovered their plans. Instead, I made one phone call that changed everything, to my grandfather's attorney, 3 months before his passing. What happened the day of the will reading wasn't just unexpected. It was the beginning of my family's carefully constructed plan crumbling around them. But the worst part wasn't just the betrayal or the potential financial loss. It was realizing how meticulously they'd planned it all, how many lies they'd told over months, and the shocking lengths they were willing to go to leave me with nothing. This is the story of how I fought back when my own blood turned against me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I still remember that Monday morning in June. The summer sunlight filtered through the blinds of my downtown apartment as I sipped coffee and prepared for another week at the marketing firm where I'd worked for the past 5 years. My phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Ethan. "Family meeting at Uncle Richard's tonight. Important." I frowned at the screen. A family meeting with no advance notice wasn't typical, especially since my grandfather, William Blackwell, had been in declining health for months. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I had visited Grandpa William just yesterday at his estate, reading to him from his favorite Hemingway novel while he drifted in and out of sleep, his once powerful frame now fragile against the hospital bed that had been installed in his study. I called my uncle immediately. "Richard, is everything okay? Is it Grandpa?" There was a pause before my uncle answered, his voice unnaturally formal. "Morgan, yes, we need to discuss some family matters, 8 o'clock sharp." "Is Grandpa all right?" I pressed. "He's stable," Richard replied tersely. "This is about other arrangements. Just be there." I arrived at Uncle Richard's sprawling colonial home at 7:55 that evening, parking behind a row of familiar family vehicles. My cousin Ethan's new Mercedes gleamed under the security lights, a recent purchase he'd been oddly secretive about. My Aunt Vivian's Range Rover sat beside my Uncle Gregory's Tesla. The gang's all here. The moment I stepped into Richard's wood-paneled study, the conversation halted. My 3 cousins, 2 uncles, and Aunt Vivian turned to look at me with expressions ranging from annoyance to poorly concealed hostility. "You're early," Richard said, glancing at his Rolex. "You said 8 sharp," I replied, taking the only remaining seat, a hard-backed chair separated from the intimate circle of plush leather furniture where the others sat. Uncle Gregory cleared his throat. "We were just discussing the practical matters related to Father's estate, given how things have developed." "What things?" I asked, looking around the room. "Has something changed with Grandpa's condition?" Aunt Vivian's perfectly manicured hand fluttered dismissively. "Nothing immediate, dear. But at 92, with his health failing, we need to be prepared." My cousin Madison, never one for subtlety, cut in. "We're discussing the future of Meridian Enterprises." Meridian Enterprises, my grandfather's company, the multi-million-dollar engineering firm he had built from nothing over 60 years. The company that had funded the privileged lives everyone in this room enjoyed, including mine. The company where I'd spent every summer since I was 16 learned the business from the ground up, much to the irritation of my cousins who preferred spending their vacations in the Hamptons or Europe. "Shouldn't Grandpa be involved in those discussions?" I asked carefully. Richard leaned forward, hands clasped. "Father has entrusted me with certain decisions. As the eldest son and current CFO of Meridian, it falls to me to ensure a smooth Transition. Something about the way he emphasized smooth transition sent a warning flare through my mind. What kind of transition are we talking about? I pressed. Madison rolled her eyes. A practical one, obviously. Uncle Richard has been running day-to-day operations for years anyway. Grandpa's just been a figurehead since his stroke 3 years ago. I felt my temper flare. A figurehead? He founded the company, and even after his stroke, he's been involved in every major decision. I was in the hospital room when he rejected the Westlake acquisition because the company culture didn't align with Meridian's values. Oh, please, Ethan scoffed. That cost us a 30% stock increase. More evidence he should have stepped aside years ago. I stared at him, stunned by his callousness. So what exactly is being proposed here? Richard exchanged glances with Gregory before responding. We're restructuring the leadership succession at Meridian. I'll be stepping into the CEO position effective immediately, with Gregory as COO and the children, he gestured to my cousins, taking on executive roles, according to their strengths. And what about me? I asked, though I already knew the answer from their expressions. You've chosen your path, Morgan, Richard said with false sympathy. You left Meridian to pursue marketing. You made it very clear you wanted independence from the family business. I sat up straighter. I worked at Meridian every summer and holiday break through college. I only took the marketing job because Grandpa suggested I gain outside experience before returning. He always said diverse perspectives, strengthened leadership. That was before his health declined, Gregory interjected smoothly. Plans change. The company needs stability now, not experimentation. I looked around the room, at these people I'd known my entire life, suddenly seeing them as strangers. And Grandpa has agreed to this reorganization? The silence that followed told me everything. You haven't even discussed this with him, have you? I whispered, realization dawning. You're planning to present this as a fait accompli once he's gone. Richard's face hardened. We're being practical, Morgan. Father isn't thinking clearly anymore. He's sentimental, making decisions based on emotion rather than business sense. Sentimental? I repeated. You mean like caring about his actual legacy instead of just profit margins? The reading of the will is scheduled for next month, Vivian cut in, clearly trying to redirect the conversation. We're simply preparing for the inevitable transition. Richard has been Father's right hand for decades. It only makes sense that what? I interrupted. That you carve up Meridian before Grandpa is even gone? That you exclude me entirely from the company I've been preparing to help lead since I was 16? The company Grandpa and I have discussed countless times? Madison sighed dramatically. Always the victim, aren't you, Morgan? This isn't personal. It's business. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. When is the will reading? Why wasn't I informed? Richard waved his hand dismissively. It's scheduled for July 15th, assuming, well, and you weren't informed because it doesn't concern you directly. Father's attorney suggested we keep the circle small to avoid unnecessary stress. July 15th, 3 weeks away. I felt sick imagining them waiting for my grandfather to pass so they could implement their plan. I looked at each of their faces, searching for any sign of shame or regret, but found only calculation and impatience. I think I should go, I said, quietly, gathering my purse. Morgan? Richard called as I reached the door. Family loyalty means everything in times like these. I hope we can count on your discretion regarding tonight's discussion. I turned back, meeting his gaze steadily. Loyalty goes both ways, Uncle Richard. Something this family seems to have forgotten. As I walked to my car, the warm summer evening felt suddenly cold. I sat behind the wheel, my hands shaking with anger and betrayal. They had planned this so carefully, cutting me out while presenting a united front. But why? What had I done to deserve exclusion from not just the company, but apparently from my grandfather's will as well? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in months. James Harrington, my grandfather's personal attorney for over 40 years. I needed answers, and I needed them quickly. What I didn't know then was that this single call would completely alter the course of the next few weeks, and the future of Meridian Enterprises itself. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. James Harrington answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying the same measured tone I remembered from childhood visits to my grandfather's study. "Morgan, this is unexpected. How are you?" "I need to see you," I said, cutting straight to the point as I pulled out of Uncle Richard's driveway. "It's about Grandpa and Meridian. My family just had a meeting I wasn't supposed to know about." There was a pause on the line. "I see. I can meet you tomorrow morning at 7:30 at my office, before my regular appointments begin. Would that work?" "I'll be there," I promised, relief washing over me. At least someone was willing to talk to me. That night was the longest of my life. I lay awake replaying the coldness in my relatives' eyes, trying to understand when everything had changed. Had they always seen me as an outsider? Was it because I was the only grandchild who'd pursued education outside the family's traditional engineering and business roots? Or was there something deeper, something I wasn't seeing? I arrived at Harrington and Associates at 7:15 the next morning, bleary-eyed but determined. The elegant brownstone that housed James's practice was quiet, the reception area empty except for a young assistant who nodded at me knowingly. "Ms. Blackwell? Mr. Harrington is expecting you. Second door on the right." James stood as I entered, his tall frame still imposing despite his 70-plus years. The lines around his eyes had deepened since I'd last seen him, but his gaze remained sharp and assessing. "Morgan," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his immaculate desk. "You look troubled." I sank into the leather seat, suddenly uncertain where to begin. My family is planning to take over Meridian the moment Grandpa passed away. They've already decided who gets what positions, and I'm being cut out entirely. They're even excluding me from the reading. James's expression remained neutral as he sat down, but I noticed his fingers tapping slightly against his desk, a tell I remembered from childhood when something displeased him. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. I recounted the previous night's meeting in detail, watching as James took occasional notes in a small leather-bound book. When I finished, he closed the notebook and studied me for a long moment. "What do you know about the current ownership structure of Meridian Enterprises?" he asked finally. The question caught me off guard. "I know Grandpa is the majority shareholder. Uncle Richard has about 20%, Uncle Gregory around 15%. And the remaining shares are distributed among the board and key executives." James nodded slowly. "That was the structure until approximately 3 months ago." My heart skipped. "What happened 3 months ago?" James stood and walked to a painting on the wall, a landscape of the Montana mountains where my grandfather had grown up. He swung the frame aside, revealing a wall safe that he opened with practiced movements. From inside, he retrieved a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather executed some significant changes to both his estate planning and the ownership structure of Meridian," he said, returning to his desk. "Changes he specifically asked me not to disclose to anyone in the family until after his passing, with one exception." He slid the envelope across the desk. My name was written on it in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, the letters slightly more tremulous than I remembered. "He instructed me to give this to you if you ever came to me with concerns about the family's intentions regarding Meridian," James explained. "He predicted something like this might happen." With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandfather's, though it showed signs of the weakness that had gradually claimed his once vigorous body. "My dearest Morgan, if you're reading this, then my suspicions about certain members of our family have proven correct, and you've found yourself excluded from discussions about Meridian's future. First, let me say how deeply sorry I am that you're experiencing this betrayal. Family should protect, not wound. I've watched you grow from a curious child who asked endless questions about the big building with my name on it to a thoughtful, young woman who understands that a company is more than balance sheets and profit margins. You've shown me time and again that you grasp what truly matters: the people who make Meridian work, the communities we serve, and the legacy we leave. 3 months ago, I made changes that will likely surprise our family considerably. While Richard believes he's been managing Meridian these past few years, I've been carefully evaluating everyone's true motivations. What I've discovered has been disappointing, to say the least. Effective immediately upon your reading this letter, 51% of Meridian Enterprises has been transferred into a trust with you as the primary trustee and beneficiary. The paperwork has been completed, filed, and is entirely legal and binding. In simple terms, Morgan, you now own controlling interest in Meridian Enterprises. The remaining shares have been redistributed in a manner I believe reflects true merit and loyalty. James has the complete details and will guide you through implementation. This decision wasn't made lightly or in haste. I've spent years watching how each family member approaches business, life, and relationships. I've seen who visits me because they want something, and who visits because they care. I've noticed who asks about quarterly projections and who asks about the well-being of our employees. You, Morgan, have consistently demonstrated the values upon which I built Meridian. Not perfect, perhaps, who is, but guided by principles. Stronger than mere self-interest. There will be resistance, anger, and likely legal challenges. James is prepared for all of this. Trust him, as I have. Remember what I've always told you. Integrity isn't just about doing right when it's easy, but, especially when it's hard and costs you something, leading Meridian will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. But I believe in you, completely. With all my love and confidence, your grandfather. William. I read the letter twice more, my vision blurring with tears. When I finally looked up, James was watching me with quiet understanding. "Is this real?" I whispered. "I own Meridian?" "You are the controlling trustee of the Blackwell Legacy Trust, which owns 51% of Meridian Enterprises," James confirmed. "The transfer was completed and filed with the SEC 92 days ago. Your grandfather remained as chairman and CEO on paper, but legally, the company has been under your control since then." I struggled to process this information. "But I've been working at Carson Marketing all this time, completely unaware." "That was by design," James explained. "William wanted to see how events would unfold naturally, without anyone, including you, knowing about the transfer. He believed the family would show their true intentions if they thought the succession was still undecided. And they did," I murmured, remembering the cold calculation in Uncle Richard's study. James nodded grimly. "Your grandfather was a keen judge of character. He's been testing Richard's leadership for years, giving him enough rope to either prove himself worthy or," he trailed off, "or hang himself," I finished. "And based on last night's meeting, he's done exactly that." "It appears so," James agreed. "The question now is, what do you want to do with this information?" I stared down at my grandfather's letter again, tracing his signature with my fingertip. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders, not just for a company, but for my grandfather's legacy, for the employees whose livelihoods depended on Meridian's success, for the future he had entrusted specifically to me. "They're planning to announce the restructuring soon," I said slowly, thinking through the implications. "They don't know I already own the company. They don't even know Grandpa changed the ownership structure at all." "Correct," James confirmed. "Apart from myself, my partner who handled the filings, and your grandfather, no one knows about this arrangement. Your family is operating under outdated assumptions." A plan began forming in my mind. Not born of vengeance, though the hurt from my family's betrayal still stung, but from a determination to honor my grandfather's faith in me. The reading is scheduled for July 15th, I said, straightening in. My chair. Let them continue believing they've excluded me. Let them announce their grand restructuring plans. And then? A small smile crossed James's face, the first I'd seen since arriving. And then? And then we show them who really owns Meridian Enterprises. The next 3 weeks required the performance of a lifetime. Each morning, I went to my marketing job as usual, crafted campaign strategies, attended client meetings, and maintained the appearance of someone completely unaware that they now controlled a $350 million company. Evenings were spent in secret, meetings with James, reviewing Meridian's financial records, organizational structure, and the questionable decisions that had been made in recent months. Your Uncle Richard has been quietly preparing for a corporate restructuring that would have consolidated power among just a few executives, primarily family members, James explained one evening, spreading documents across the conference table in his office. He's been promising significant compensation packages to key board members who support his vision. I studied the proposed organizational chart, noting how my cousins Madison, Ethan, and Blake were positioned in VP roles they were woefully unqualified for. This would have gutted the company's middle management, people who've been loyal to Meridian for decades. Precisely, James agreed, sliding another document toward me. And these projections show the likely financial impact of their planned efficiency measures, essentially cutting the research and development departments that don't show immediate profit but have historically driven Meridian's innovation. My grandfather had built Meridian on the principle that engineering excellence required investment in ideas that might not pay off immediately. His patience had resulted in several industry-changing patents that competitors had rushed to license. They would have destroyed everything he built, I murmured, the betrayal cutting deeper with each new discovery. Which is exactly why William made the changes he did, James replied. He saw this coming long before any of us. During this time, I received exactly 2 text messages from family members. One from Madison asking if I was still upset about the family meeting, and another from Uncle Gregory reminding me that discretion is appreciated during this difficult time. Neither mentioned my grandfather's declining health directly. Neither asked how I was feeling. I made a point of visiting Grandpa William every day after work, relieved to find that while my family spoke of his mental decline, he remained lucid during most of my visits. His body was failing him, but his mind remained sharp. I was careful never to mention what I knew, both to honor his wishes and because I wasn't entirely sure who among the nursing staff might report back to Richard or Gregory. Instead, we talked about books, memories, and occasionally, in veiled terms that outsiders wouldn't understand, about Meridian. The foundation matters more than the facade, he told me during one evening visit, his voice barely above a whisper. Remember that when the storms come. I squeezed his hand gently, understanding the double meaning. I will, Grandpa. I promise. 10 days before the scheduled reading, my phone rang at 3:17 a.m. It was the private nurse my grandfather had insisted on hiring himself, rather than allowing Richard to choose his care team. Ms. Blackwell, I think you should come quickly, she said, her usually calm voice tight with emotion. Your grandfather is asking for you. I drove through the empty pre-dawn streets to the Blackwell estate, my heart hammering against my ribs. The grand house was mostly dark, except for lights in the east wing where Grandpa's suite was located. I noticed Uncle Richard's car wasn't there, despite his insistence that he was overseeing Father's care personally. The nurse, Elena, met me at the side entrance. He's been declining rapidly since midnight, she explained as we hurried through the quiet hallways. He refused pain medication until he could see you. When I entered his room, my breath caught. My grandfather looked so diminished against the white sheets, his once commanding presence reduced to a fragile collection of bones beneath paper-thin skin. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that could see through any deception, remained unchanged. "Morgan," he whispered, lifting a trembling hand. I rushed to his side, taking his cold fingers in mine. "I'm here, Grandpa." His gaze held mine with surprising intensity. "You know now," he said, not a question but a statement. I nodded, tears threatening. "Yes? I know everything." A ghost of his old smile touched his lips. "And? I won't let you down," I promised, my voice breaking. "I understand why you did what you did." He nodded slightly, seeming to relax at my words. "There's a safe," he whispered. "Behind the Remington in my study. Combination is your birthday. More information there. Things you'll need." "I'll find it," I assured him, squeezing his hand. "Your grandmother always said—" He paused, drawing a labored breath. "You were the one most like me, too stubborn for your own good." His attempt at a chuckle dissolved into a cough. She was right. We sat in silence for several minutes, his breathing becoming more strained. I wanted to call for Elena, for a doctor, for anyone who might help, but the peaceful acceptance in his eyes told me he had made his peace with what was coming. "The others will fight you," he said finally, each word clearly costing him precious energy. "Remember, Meridian is not just buildings and contracts, it's people. Always the people." "I know, Grandpa," I whispered, tears flowing freely now. "I've always known that." His fingers tightened around mine with surprising strength. "Promise me one thing." "Anything." "Be fair," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "Even to those who haven't been fair to you. Lead with justice, not vengeance." The request knocked the air from my lungs. Even now, facing death, his concern was for the family who had betrayed him, and me. "I promise," I managed. He nodded once, satisfied, then his gaze drifted to the window where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. "Beautiful morning," he murmured. Those were his last coherent words to me. He slipped into unconsciousness shortly after, and by the time the rest of the family arrived, summoned by Elena's calls, he was gone. William Edward Blackwell, founder of Meridian Enterprises, grandfather, visionary, and the strongest person I had ever known, passed away as the sun crested the horizon, painting his room in shades of gold. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, condolence calls, and the peculiar politics of a wealthy family in mourning. Richard immediately took charge, controlling access to information about the memorial service, making decisions without consultation, and positioning himself as the new patriarch. I was conspicuously excluded from most of these arrangements, invited only to review the final plans rather than help create them. "We didn't want to burden you during your grief," Aunt Vivian explained with manufactured sympathy when I questioned my exclusion. The study's safe yielded exactly what Grandpa had promised: a USB drive containing years of emails between Richard and various board members, detailed notes about questionable financial decisions that had been hidden from my grandfather, and most damning of all, a recording of Richard telling Gregory that, once the old man is gone, we'll finally run Meridian the way it should be run. 2 days before the memorial service, I stood in my apartment staring at the elegant black dress, laid out on my bed when my phone rang. It was James. "Morgan, we need to talk immediately," he said without preamble. "Richard has moved up the will reading to tomorrow morning, directly after the memorial service." My stomach dropped. That wasn't the plan. We were supposed to have another week to prepare. "He's claiming it's for efficiency since everyone will already be gathered," James explained, frustration evident in his tone. "But I believe he's hoping to capitalize on the emotional vulnerability of the moment, to push through his agenda without resistance." I sank onto the edge of my bed. Is it going to work? There was a pause before James answered. That depends entirely on you, Morgan. Are you ready to take control of Meridian a week earlier than we planned? Was I ready? The truth was, I didn't. No. The grief of losing my grandfather was still raw, a constant ache beneath my breastbone. The betrayal of my family still stung like salt in an open wound, and the responsibility of leading a company that employed over 2,000 people terrified me. But I remembered my promise to Grandpa, to lead with justice, not vengeance. To remember that Meridian was about people, not profits. Yes, I said finally, my resolve strengthening with each word. I'm ready. Let's give them exactly the reading they deserve. As I hung up, I looked again at the black dress waiting for tomorrow's service. It would serve two purposes now, mourning the grandfather I had loved and marking the end of the family's illusions about who would control his legacy. Richard had changed the timeline, hoping to catch me unprepared. But what he didn't realize was that I'd inherited more than just Grandpa's shares. I'd inherited his strategic mind and his unflinching courage when facing a fight that mattered. Let them rush the will reading. Let them believe their plan was working perfectly. Tomorrow would bring revelations none of them were prepared for. Morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, casting jewel-toned patterns across the somber gathering. The memorial service for William Blackwell drew a crowd that filled every pew: business associates, community leaders, employees, and friends who had known my grandfather throughout his remarkable life. I sat in the front row, separated from Richard and the rest of the family by an empty seat that no one had dared to fill. The physical distance mirrored the emotional chasm that had opened between us, though only I understood its true depth. Throughout the service, I felt eyes on me. Curious glances from those who had heard rumors of family discord, sympathetic looks from those who knew me personally. Richard delivered the eulogy, his voice appropriately grave as he spoke of my grandfather's business acumen and civic contributions. What struck me most was what he didn't mention: Grandpa's fierce loyalty to employees, his belief that wealth created obligation to the community, and his insistence that integrity mattered more than profit. The portrait Richard painted was of a shrewd businessman whose legacy would be measured in dollars. The grandfather I knew had measured success in life. When the service concluded, Richard approached the pulpit once more. The family will now proceed to William's home for a private reception and the reading of his will. We thank you all for coming today. The dismissal was clear. Only those explicitly invited should continue on to the Blackwell estate. I noticed several longtime Meridian executives exchanging uncertain glances, having expected to be included in this next step, as they had been for all significant family events in the past. As I rose to leave, James appeared at my elbow, immaculate in a charcoal suit. "Ready?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my throat tight. As I'll ever be. The drive to the estate was silent, James focusing on navigating the procession of black cars while I mentally rehearsed what was to come. We had spent hours preparing for this moment, yet nothing could fully ready me for confronting my family's betrayal in such a public setting. The Blackwell estate's great room had been arranged for the occasion. A heavy mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by leather chairs. Family portraits watched from the walls, 3 generations of Blackwells, including a large oil painting of my grandfather in his prime, standing before the First Meridian headquarters. As mourners filed in, I noticed the careful orchestration of seating. Richard, Gregory, and their children were positioned at the table's head, with other relatives arranged by perceived importance. My name card sat at the furthest end, almost an afterthought. I caught James's eye across the room. With a nearly imperceptible nod, I moved deliberately to a seat directly opposite Richard, one reserved for Madison. I removed her name card and placed mine instead. "I believe there's been a mistake with the seating," I said calmly when Madison arrived. her expression souring at finding me in her place. "That's my seat," she hissed, low enough that others wouldn't hear. I smiled placidly. "Not today." Before she could protest further, James cleared his throat. "If everyone would please be seated, we can begin." Richard frowned at the disruption to his careful choreography, but evidently decided not to make a scene. Madison reluctantly took the seat I had abandoned, her glare burning into the side of my face. "Ladies and gentlemen, family and close associates of William Blackwell," James began formally, opening a leather portfolio. "We are gathered to execute the final wishes of William Edward Blackwell, as expressed in his last will and testament, dated April 17th of this year." A murmur rippled through the gathering. April 17th, just 3 months ago. Most had assumed my grandfather's will had been established years earlier and merely updated periodically. This entirely new document suggested more substantial changes than anyone had anticipated. No one looked more surprised or concerned than Richard. "Is there a problem, Uncle?" I asked innocently. Richard composed himself quickly. "No problem. Please continue, James." James adjusted his reading glasses. Before addressing specific bequests, Mr. Blackwell included a personal message to be read aloud at this gathering. He unfolded a letter, and I recognized my grandfather's stationery immediately. When James began reading, it was almost as if Grandpa himself was speaking to the room. "To those gathered today, if you're hearing these words, then I have completed my journey. Do not mourn too deeply. I have lived exactly the life I chose, with few regrets and many joys. Business success is hollow without principle. Wealth is meaningless without purpose. And family, true family, is defined not by blood, but by loyalty, respect and love freely given. Throughout my life, I have watched carefully to see who understood these truths. Some of you have disappointed me deeply. Others have confirmed my highest hopes. Today's provisions reflect those observations. Remember this: what we build outlasts us only if its foundation is strong. Meridian was built on integrity, innovation, and treating people with dignity. Any other approach will surely see it crumble. Now let us proceed with clear eyes and honest hearts. The truth, however uncomfortable, will now be spoken." James paused, allowing the words to settle over the silent room. Richard shifted in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. "With respect to Meridian Enterprises," James continued, "William made substantial changes to the ownership structure on April 17th. These changes were legally executed and filed with all appropriate regulatory bodies at that time." He looked up, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on me. "The majority controlling interest of Meridian Enterprises, specifically 51% of all shares, was transferred to the Blackwell Legacy Trust, with Morgan Blackwell named as sole trustee and primary beneficiary." The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath as every person processed what they'd just heard. Then Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "That's impossible," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Father would never—" "I assure you, it's not only possible but completely finalized," James interrupted, his tone professionally detached as he removed a document from his portfolio and slid it across the table. "The transfer was completed 92 days ago. SEC filings were properly submitted. Morgan has been the controlling shareholder of Meridian Enterprises for over 3 months." Gregory snatched the document before Richard could reach it, his eyes scanning frantically down the page. "This can't be legal. Father wasn't in his right mind. We'll contest it." "You're welcome to try," James replied evenly. However, Mr. Blackwell underwent comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluation immediately before executing these changes, specifically to prevent such challenges. The examination confirmed he was of completely sound mind and under no undue influence. Richard turned to me, his face contorted with fury and disbelief. You knew about this. All this time pretending to be the excluded victim? I learned about it 3 weeks ago, I replied calmly. After you all met to discuss how to divide Meridian among yourselves once Grandpa was gone. After you deliberately excluded me from the will reading. After you began undermining executives who might have opposed your restructuring plans. Madison looked between her father and me, comprehension dawning. You've been playing us? No, Madison, I've been watching you play yourselves. I opened my purse and withdrew the USB drive from Grandpa's safe. I have recordings of conversations between various family members discussing how to dismantle departments that Grandpa valued. I have emails detailing plans to terminate employees whose only crime was loyalty to William Blackwell's vision. I have spreadsheets showing how company resources were already being redirected to pet projects that would have personally enriched certain people in this room. The color drained from Richard's face as he recognized the implications. Not just the loss of control he'd expected to gain, but potential legal liability for actions taken in anticipation of that control. The remaining shares have been redistributed, James continued, seemingly immune to the emotional currents swirling through the room. Richard Blackwell now holds 10% of Meridian shares, reduced from his previous 20%. Gregory Blackwell holds 7%, reduced from 15%. Each announcement landed like a physical blow. Cousins who had expected significant stakes received minimal holdings. Board members who had aligned with Richard found their influence diluted. And most surprisingly, to everyone but me, several long-term employees who had no family connection, but had shown unwavering commitment to Meridian's values, discovered they now held meaningful ownership positions. This is revenge, Richard finally said, looking directly at me. You turned father against his own sons. I met his gaze steadily. No, Uncle Richard. This is justice. Grandpa saw exactly who you were and what you planned to do with his life's work. He made his choices accordingly. I stood, smoothing my black dress. As for me, I'll be taking my rightful place as CEO of Meridian Enterprises effective immediately, as stipulated in the trust documents. As the implications of this statement rippled through the room, I realized this moment wasn't just about winning or losing control of a company. It was about honoring a legacy, not just of business success, but of the values that had made that success meaningful. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since discovering my family's betrayal, I felt completely certain I was on the right side of it. The reception room cleared quickly after the reading. Richard stormed out first, followed by Gregory and their spouses. My cousins lingered briefly, their expressions a mix of shock, anger, and, in Ethan's case, a calculating reassessment of where I now stood in the family hierarchy. Several board members approached to offer congratulations, their sincerity varying widely depending on their previous alliances. Through it all, I maintained the composed exterior that Grandpa had taught me was essential in business. Never let them see you sweat, he used to say. Decisions made in emotion are rarely your best ones. When the last guest departed, I sank into the nearest chair, suddenly exhausted. The performance had drained me more than I'd anticipated. You did well, James said, pouring 2 fingers of my grandfather's favorite bourbon into crystal tumblers. He handed one to me before taking the seat opposite. William would have been proud. I accepted the drink, swirling the amber liquid. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Indeed. James sipped his bourbon thoughtfully. Richard has already called our office 3 times. His personal attorney is demanding a formal review of the trust documents. Let them review. Everything is ironclad, right? Absolutely. But legal challenges, even baseless ones, can be disruptive and expensive. I set my glass down untouched. What's our next move? James smiled slightly at my use of our. You need to establish physical presence at Meridian immediately. Tomorrow morning, first thing. The news will spread quickly, and you want to control the narrative before Richard or Gregory can poison the well. I haven't set foot in Meridian headquarters in almost a year, I said, reality settling in. I'll be walking in as CEO to people who may not even recognize me. Which is why presentation matters. Confidence, clarity, and a vision that honors William's legacy while acknowledging necessary evolution. James checked his watch. The executive team needs to hear from you directly before the rumor mill takes over. I've taken the liberty of calling an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. My stomach tightened. That's fast. This transition requires decisive action. Hesitation creates vacuums, and vacuums invite power struggles. He studied me carefully. Are you having second thoughts? I thought about the question seriously. Was I ready to step into my grandfather's shoes? To lead a company through what would certainly be a turbulent transition? To face family members who now saw me as their enemy? No, I said finally. No, second thoughts. Just first-time nerves. That's healthy, James assured me. Overconfidence would concern me more than appropriate apprehension. We spent the next several hours strategizing my first days as CEO. James had already prepared a transition plan, complete with key personnel files, pending contracts requiring immediate attention, and a communication strategy for employees, clients, and shareholders. By midnight, my head was swimming with information, but I felt more prepared than I'd expected. James departed with a promise to meet me at Meridian Tower at 8 a.m. sharp. Alone in my grandfather's study, surrounded by the books, awards, and mementos of his remarkable life, I finally allowed myself a moment of genuine grief. Not just for Grandpa himself, but for the family relationships that might never recover from today's revelations. Had Richard always resented his father's vision for Meridian? Had my uncles always seen me as an obstacle rather than family? The childhood memories I treasured, holiday gatherings, summer vacations at the lake house, celebrations of milestones both personal and professional, were now tinged with doubt. Has any of it been genuine? I slept in my old bedroom at the estate that night, finding strange comfort in the familiar surroundings. Morning arrived too quickly, sunlight streaming through curtains I had chosen as a teenager. I showered, dressed in the tailored charcoal suit I'd brought for the occasion, and stood before the mirror for a final assessment. The woman staring back at me looked remarkably like my mother in the portrait hanging downstairs. Same determined chin, same analytical gaze. Mom had died when I was 12, but Grandpa always said I'd inherited her best qualities. Compassion tempered with pragmatism and courage that grew stronger under pressure. I hoped he was right. When I arrived at Meridian Tower at 7:45 a.m., James was already waiting in the lobby, briefcase in hand and a coffee extended toward me. Perfect timing, he said, eyes approving my professional appearance. Security has been updated with your clearance. You now have access to your executive suite on the top floor. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt surreal. I had visited my grandfather's office countless times growing up, but always as his granddaughter, never as the company's new leader. The executive floor was quiet when we arrived, most staff not due for another hour. William Blackwell's office, my office now, was exactly as he had left it. The expansive desk faced floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with engineering texts, business references, and the classics he loved. Photos documented Meridian's growth from a small engineering firm to an industry leader. One photo in particular caught my eye. Grandpa and me at my college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming. He kept that one front and center, James observed, following my gaze. Even when updating other photos, that one never moved. A lump formed in my throat. I've been thinking about what he would do in this situation, how he would handle the transition. With decisiveness balanced by wisdom, James replied, which is precisely what you need to demonstrate this morning. The board meeting was scheduled in the main conference room adjacent to the executive suite. By 8:30, executives and board members began arriving, their expressions revealing varying degrees of surprise at finding me already installed in the CEO's office. Some offered polite greetings, others merely nodded awkwardly before continuing. To the conference room. At 8:55, I gathered my notes and stood. "Ready?" James asked. "As I'll ever be." The conference room fell silent as I entered. 14 people sat around the massive table, their collective experience representing over 2 centuries in the engineering industry. Some faces I recognized from family events. Others I knew only from the personnel files I'd reviewed overnight. Richard's seat was conspicuously empty. Gregory sat rigid in his chair, pointedly avoiding my gaze. "Good morning," I began, taking the chair at the head of the table, my grandfather's chair. "Thank you all for accommodating this meeting on short notice. As you've no doubt heard, significant changes have occurred in Meridian's leadership structure." Paused, meeting each person's eyes briefly before continuing. William Blackwell made deliberate decisions about Meridian's future before his passing. As his granddaughter, I'm deeply committed to honoring his legacy. As Meridian's new CEO, I'm equally committed to ensuring this company's continued success. The tension in the room was palpable. Teresa Hammond, the long-serving CFO who had often mediated between my grandfather and Richard, spoke first. "Morgan, while I mean no disrespect, this transition raises obvious questions. You've been absent from Meridian for some time. Your background is in marketing, not engineering. The learning curve is steep," I acknowledged. "I don't pretend otherwise. My grandfather valued expertise, which is why my first act as CEO will be to establish a transitional leadership council comprising the most experienced voices in this room. I need your knowledge. Meridian needs your commitment." This direct acknowledgement of my limitations seemed to surprise them. Several people sat straighter, their expressions softening slightly. "And Richard?" asked Jonathan Pierce, a board member, who had consistently aligned with my uncle. "What role will he play going forward?" "That depends entirely on Richard," I replied candidly. "His institutional knowledge is valuable. His expertise in international markets is significant. If he chooses to remain with Meridian in his capacity as head of global development, that position remains open to him." Gregory finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "And if he doesn't?" I met his gaze steadily. "Then we'll adapt, as Meridian has always done when facing challenges. No individual, including me, is irreplaceable." For the next hour, I outlined my immediate priorities: stabilizing leadership, communicating transparently with employees, reassuring key clients, and conducting a thorough review of all projects initiated in the past 6 months. I answered questions honestly, acknowledged concerns directly, and presented a vision that balanced respect for Meridian's history with necessary evolution. By the time the meeting concluded, the atmosphere had shifted. Not to wholehearted acceptance, certainly, but from outright skepticism to cautious assessment. Several executives lingered afterward, offering insights or expressing support. Others departed quickly, undoubtedly to report to Richard. Phase 1. Complete, James murmured as the last board member left. "Next comes the company-wide announcement." I nodded, suddenly aware that the day's greatest challenges still lay ahead. I had survived the first test, but convincing the board was only the beginning. Meridian's 2,000 employees, Richard's inevitable counterattack, and the market's reaction to the leadership change would determine whether I could truly fulfill my grandfather's faith in me. The weight of responsibility settled more firmly on my shoulders. This wasn't just about proving my family wrong anymore. It was about proving my grandfather right. By noon, word had spread throughout Meridian Tower. Employees gathered in small clusters, conversations pausing whenever I walked past. The company-wide email announcing my appointment had gone out at 10:30 a.m., followed by a video message where I introduced myself to those who might not know me and outlined my commitment to Meridian's core values. Teresa Hammond, the CFO, proved to be an unexpected ally. After the board meeting, she'd stopped by my office with financial reports I hadn't yet seen and a candid assessment of the company's current position. "Your grandfather kept these projections separate from the standard reporting," she explained, pointing to a folder marked Contingency Planning. "He was concerned about certain initiatives Richard was pushing, primarily the Westlake acquisition, and the proposed cuts to the research division." I studied the numbers, seeing my grandfather's meticulous analysis. "He was building a case," Teresa nodded. "William never confronted Richard directly. I think he was gathering evidence while determining the best path forward." She hesitated before adding, "He asked me about you several times in recent months. Your approaches to problem solving, your management style at your marketing firm. At the time, I didn't realize why." "He was vetting me," I said, the realization both touching and sobering. Grandpa hadn't simply handed me Meridian out of sentimentality. He'd been evaluating whether I was truly the right choice. "And you passed," Teresa confirmed. "For what it's worth, I think he made the right decision." Her support meant more than she could know. Teresa had been with Meridian for 27 years, rising from staff accountant to CFO through talent and determination. She had no family connections, no agenda beyond the company's welfare. If she was willing to give me a chance, others might follow. The afternoon brought a steady stream of department heads to my office, some clearly sent to take my measure, others genuinely seeking direction during the transition. I listened more. Then I spoke, taking mental notes on who seemed aligned with my vision versus those still loyal to Richard. At 3:45 p.m., my assistant, inherited from my grandfather and still adjusting to serving a new Blackwell, appeared at my door. "Ms. Blackwell, your cousin Ethan is here. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's quite persistent." I was surprised. Of all my cousins, Ethan had been the most openly dismissive of my capabilities over the years. "Send him in, please," Ethan entered with none of his usual swagger, closing the door quietly behind him. He stood awkwardly before my desk, as if suddenly unsure of himself. "Have a seat," I offered, gesturing to the chair opposite me. He sat, fidgeting with his watch, a nervous habit since childhood. "This is weird," he finally said. "Seeing you behind that desk." "Life takes unexpected turns," I replied neutrally. "Look, I'll get straight to the point. Dad and Uncle Richard are planning something. They've been on calls all morning with lawyers, board members, and major shareholders." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They're building a case that Grandpa was manipulated at the end, that you and James Harrington took advantage of his declining health to orchestrate this takeover." I kept my expression controlled, though anger flared at the accusation. "That's both false and offensive." "I know," Ethan said, surprising me again. "That's why I'm here." I studied him carefully, looking for the trap. Ethan and I had never been close. Our relationship defined more by competition than connection. "Why are you telling me this?" He sighed, suddenly looking tired. "Because I was in the room this morning when Dad and Uncle Richard were strategizing. They're not just trying to regain control of Meridian. They're willing to destroy your reputation, drag Grandpa's name through public scrutiny, and potentially damage the company in the process." He met my eyes directly. "I may not have always liked you, Morgan, but I respect what Meridian stands for." "What Grandpa built?" I wasn't entirely convinced. "This sudden concern for the company is unexpected." "I know how it looks," he acknowledged. "But contrary to what you might think, I actually care about my position here. I've worked hard to prove myself in the European division. Maybe not as hard as you, but—" He shrugged. "I've got skin in the game. If Dad and Uncle Richard burn everything down trying to oust you, what's left for any of us?" Self-interest, then. That made more sense than sudden family loyalty. But even self-interested allies had their uses. "What exactly are they planning?" I asked. "An emergency shareholder meeting next week." They're lobbying key investors to support a vote of no confidence in your leadership. Ethan's expression was grim. They're also preparing a legal filing, challenging the trust's validity, with a request for an immediate injunction preventing you from making any significant company decisions while the case proceeds. The strategy was aggressive, but predictable. Richard had always favored overwhelming force in business conflicts. "And you're not on board with this approach?" Ethan hesitated. "I think it's short-sighted. The legal battle would be public, messy, and damaging to everyone involved. Meridian's stock would take a hit. Client confidence would waver." He shook his head. "There has to be a better way, one that doesn't tear apart both the company and what's left of this family." I considered his words carefully, searching for deception. While I wasn't naive enough to trust Ethan completely, his assessment matched my own concerns. A protracted legal battle would harm Meridian, regardless of who ultimately prevailed. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "A compromise." Ethan leaned forward. "You maintain majority control through the trust, but create a power-sharing arrangement on the executive level. Dad and Uncle Richard save face, the company avoids negative publicity, and operations continue without disruption." The proposal wasn't entirely unreasonable, but it revealed how little Ethan truly understood the situation. "Your father and uncle weren't planning minor adjustments to Meridian's structure, Ethan. They were dismantling core divisions, replacing experienced leaders with friends and family regardless of qualifications, and prioritizing short-term profits over long-term stability. That's exactly why Grandpa changed the ownership structure." "Then negotiate better terms," Ethan pressed. "But negotiation has to be better than all-out war." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from James. "Richard just filed for an emergency injunction. Hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. Call me ASAP." I showed the message to Ethan, whose face fell. "Looks like your father and uncle have already made their choice." "I didn't know they'd move this quickly," he said, appearing genuinely dismayed. "I thought there was time to find middle ground." "There might have been, if that's what they actually wanted." I stood, indicating our conversation was ending. "Thanks you for the warning, Ethan. Regardless of your motivations, I appreciate the information." He rose reluctantly. "What will you do now?" "Exactly what Grandpa would have done," I replied. "Protect Meridian, by whatever means necessary." After Ethan left, I called James immediately. "How bad is it?" "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," he said, his normally composed voice tight with controlled anger. "Claims of undue influence, diminished capacity, conflicts of interest on my part. They've requested a temporary restraining order preventing you from exercising any authority as CEO or trustee pending a full hearing." "Will they get it?" "Judge Lancaster has been assigned to the case. She's fair but conservative in corporate matters. If Richard's team presents even moderately convincing evidence, she might grant a limited TRO to maintain the status quo while the issues are litigated." "Which would effectively put Richard back in control," I concluded. "Since he was acting CEO before Grandpa's passing." "Precisely. We need to prepare for the hearing immediately. I'm sending a courier with documents requiring your signature. We'll need to meet tonight to prepare your testimony." The rest of the afternoon became a whirlwind of legal preparation interspersed with the ongoing demands of leading a company in transition. By 6 p.m., I was reviewing affidavits from my grandfather's doctors confirming his mental competence, while simultaneously approving the press release responding to news of the legal challenge that had already leaked to business publications. I was deep in concentration when Teresa appeared at my door. "You need to see this," she said, placing a tablet in front of me. The screen showed an internal email that had been sent to all Meridian employees from Richard's company account just minutes earlier. "Dear valued Meridian team members, by now you've heard about the controversial changes to our leadership structure. I want to assure you that this situation is temporary. The hasty appointment of an inexperienced relative to the CEO position was not my father's true intention, but rather the result of manipulation during his final illness. I have initiated appropriate legal action to correct this unfortunate situation, and expect normal operations to resume under proper leadership within days. In the meantime, please direct any significant operational decisions to your previous supervisors. We appreciate your patience during this brief disruption and your continued dedication to Meridian's success. Richard Blackwell, Executive Vice President. The boldness of the move left me momentarily speechless. Richard was creating confusion in the ranks, undermining my authority, and attempting to maintain his control structure despite the official change in leadership. He's sent similar messages to our top clients, Teresa added grimly. Several have already called asking for clarification. The challenge was direct and public. How I responded would set the tone for everything that followed. Draft a company-wide message from me, I said, rising from my desk. Make it clear but not reactive. Acknowledge the legal dispute without going into details. Emphasize stability, and confirm that the leadership structure announced this morning remains in effect. Teresa nodded, already taking notes. Then, I continued, I need the email addresses of every board member, department head, and team leader. Tonight, they'll all receive personal messages from me addressing specific concerns relevant to their areas. No form letters. Each communication needs to demonstrate that I understand their particular challenges and have concrete plans to address them. That's dozens of customized emails, Teresa pointed out. Then I better get started, I replied, my resolve hardening. Richard thinks he can win by creating confusion and doubt. We'll counter with clarity and confidence. As Teresa left to execute these directives, I turned to face the sweeping view of the city from my grandfather's, my window. The lights were coming on as dusk approached, thousands of tiny points of brightness against the gathering darkness. Tomorrow's court hearing would be critical, but tonight's battle for the hearts and minds of Meridian's people might ultimately prove more decisive. Richard had decades of relationships and institutional power on his side. I had my grandfather's faith, my own determination, and a vision for Meridian that honored its past while securing its future. It would have to be enough. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when James and I arrived the next morning. Word of the Blackwell family power struggle had reached the business press overnight, with headlines ranging from factual, Meridian leadership disputed in court, to sensational, engineering empire in chaos, Blackwell, family at war. James guided me through the throng with a protective hand at my elbow. No comments, he repeated firmly as microphones thrust toward us. All questions will be addressed after the hearing. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Richard and Gregory sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 attorneys. Overkill for a preliminary hearing, but typical of Richard's approach to conflict. My uncle's gaze tracked me as I walked to the defense table, his expression cold and calculating. Quite the audience, I murmured to James as we took our seats. Richard called in every business reporter in the city. He replied quietly. He wants public pressure regardless of the legal outcome. Judge Lancaster entered promptly at 9 a.m., a slender woman in her 60s with shrewd eyes and a reputation for cutting through legal theatrics to the heart of disputes. After the formalities, she peered over her glasses at the assembled attorneys. Let me be clear from the outset, she began. This court's time is valuable. I have reviewed the filings from both parties, and I expect arguments to be concise and directly relevant to the request for temporary injunctive relief. Save the family drama for tabloids or therapists, whichever you prefer. Her gaze swept between the tables. Are we understood? Both legal teams murmured agreement. Richard's lead attorney, a polished man named Caldwell, presented first. His argument was precisely what James had predicted. William Blackwell had been increasingly frail, both physically and mentally, in his final months. The sudden transfer of controlling interest to a granddaughter with minimal involvement in company operations, rather than to his sons who had dedicated their careers to Meridian, defied both business logic and family precedent. The trust's creation had been orchestrated by James Harrington, who stood to benefit from continued legal fees managing the complex arrangement. "Your Honor," Caldwell concluded, "we ask only for a pause, a temporary maintenance of the leadership structure that successfully guided Meridian for years, while the court properly examines the circumstances surrounding this highly unusual transfer of control." Judge Lancaster made notes throughout, her expression revealing nothing. When James rose to respond, she raised an eyebrow expectantly. "Your Honor," James began, "the plaintiff's narrative contains a fundamental misrepresentation. The transfer of Meridian's controlling interest wasn't a hasty deathbed decision, but a carefully considered restructuring implemented after thorough legal and medical consultation. William Blackwell was explicitly concerned about plans to dismantle key aspects of Meridian's operations, plans developed by his sons without his knowledge or approval." James methodically presented our evidence: the medical evaluations confirming my grandfather's mental competence, the documentation of Richard's unauthorized strategic initiatives that contradicted established company values, and, most damaging, emails between Richard and Gregory discussing how they would finally be free to run Meridian properly once father is gone. "William Blackwell built Meridian over 6 decades, James continued. He had every legal right to determine its future leadership. The trust structure he created ensures continuity of his vision, while providing appropriate checks and balances on executive authority, precisely what was lacking in the previous arrangement." Throughout James's presentation, I maintained the composed demeanor my grandfather had modeled throughout his business career, even as Richard's expression darkened with each new document displayed on the courtroom screens. When both sides concluded their initial arguments, Judge Lancaster removed her glasses and addressed us directly. "I'll hear briefly from the principals themselves," she said. "Mr. Richard Blackwell, then Ms. Morgan Blackwell. 2 minutes each." Richard straightened his tie as he approached the podium. Always impeccably dressed, today he had chosen a conservative, dark suit that emphasized his silver hair and executive bearing. "Your Honor," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "For 28 years, I have dedicated my professional life to Meridian Enterprises. From entry-level management to executive leadership, I have worked alongside my father to build upon his foundation. I've opened international markets, negotiated landmark contracts, and mentored countless employees who now hold leadership positions." He paused, his expression shifting to one of pained concern. "In his final months, my father was not the same man who built Meridian. His illness affected his judgment in ways that weren't always immediately obvious to those who saw him infrequently. Those of us who worked with him daily witnessed a gradual decline in his decision-making, a reluctance to make necessary changes, an increasing detachment from operational realities." Richard glanced toward me, his gaze a perfect blend of regret and resolve. "I challenge these recent changes not from self-interest, but from deep concern for the company my father built and the thousands of employees who depend on experienced leadership. That's all, Your Honor." Judge Lancaster nodded. "Ms. Blackwell?" I approached the podium, acutely aware of the scrutiny from every corner of the courtroom. The black dress I'd chosen was professional but understated, no power suit or ostentatious jewelry to distract from my words. "Your Honor, my grandfather often told me that integrity reveals itself most clearly not in public statements, but in private actions." I kept my voice steady, making eye contact with the judge rather than playing to the gallery as Richard had. William Blackwell spent 60 years building Meridian on principles that extended beyond profit margins. He valued innovation over quick returns, employee loyalty over cost-cutting, and long-term stability over quarterly fluctuations. I gestured briefly toward the evidence James had presented. The documents before you demonstrate that my uncles planned significant departures from these core principles, plans they deliberately concealed from my grandfather while assuring him that his vision would be honored. Drawing a measured breath, I continued. I was raised understanding Meridian's values. I worked in various departments throughout my education, learning the business from the ground up at my grandfather's insistence. When he determined that outside perspective would be valuable, I gained that experience as well, always with the understanding that I would eventually return to Meridian. I glanced briefly toward Richard, whose rehearsed concern had hardened into barely concealed animosity. This isn't about family sentiment or personal preference. It's about William Blackwell's right to ensure that the company he built continues to reflect his vision and values. The trust structure he created, with me as trustee, was his solution to preserve that legacy while acknowledging the contributions of all family members and key employees. I returned my attention to Judge Lancaster. I stand ready to honor that responsibility, Your Honor. Thank you. As I returned to my seat, I felt Richard's gaze burning into me. The judge remained inscrutable, reviewing her notes for several minutes while the courtroom waited in tense silence. I appreciate the restraint shown by both parties in presenting their positions, she said finally. This matter clearly involves complex familial and corporate considerations that warrant thorough examination. However, the immediate question before me is narrow: whether to grant temporary injunctive relief pending that fuller review. She tapped her pen against her notepad. Based on the evidence presented, I find insufficient grounds to overturn the legally executed trust arrangement established by William Blackwell. The medical documentation convincingly demonstrates his competence at the time these changes were implemented. Further, the contemporaneous records suggest his decisions were motivated by legitimate concerns about proposed strategic shifts that conflicted with his vision for the company. Richard stiffened visibly as the judge continued. Therefore, the request for a temporary restraining order is denied. Ms. Morgan Blackwell shall continue to exercise the authority granted to her as trustee and CEO until such time as a full hearing on the merits can be conducted. She fixed both parties with a stern gaze. That said, I strongly caution against any precipitous changes to Meridian's structure or operations during this interim period. This court would look unfavorably on actions that appear designed to consolidate power rather than maintain stable business operations. With a sharp rap of her gavel, Judge Lancaster concluded the hearing and departed, leaving the courtroom buzzing with reactions. James squeezed my shoulder supportively. "Round one to us," he murmured. "But Richard won't give up easily." I nodded, watching as my uncle huddled with his legal team, his expression thunderous. When he caught me looking, he didn't avert his gaze. Instead, he held it deliberately, his message clear, without words. This isn't over. Outside, the reporters swarmed again, shouting questions about the family conflict and Meridian's future. James had prepared a brief statement, which I delivered calmly before we departed for Meridian Tower. Today's ruling allows Meridian Enterprises to continue operating under the leadership structure established by William Blackwell. I remain committed to honoring my grandfather's vision while ensuring the company's continued growth and success. Meridian's employees, clients, and shareholders can be confident that our focus remains on excellence in engineering and stability in operations. As we drove away from the courthouse, my phone buzzed with messages. Some supportive, others demanding immediate attention to company matters that had been put on hold pending the hearing's outcome. The temporary victory felt hollow against the knowledge that Richard was undoubtedly already planning his next move. "What happens now?" I asked James. "Now," he said gravely. "The real battle begins." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of 18-hour days as I navigated the dual challenges of leading Meridian while defending against Richard's ongoing attacks. Though the court had denied his request for an injunction, my uncle had immediately filed a more comprehensive lawsuit challenging the trust's validity on multiple grounds. Meanwhile, he was waging a shadow campaign within the company, courting allies, spreading doubts about my capabilities, and attempting to undermine my directives through passive resistance. I was reviewing quarterly projections late one evening when Teresa knocked on my office door, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I said, setting aside the spreadsheets. "What's wrong?" She closed the door before speaking. "I've just received some concerning information from accounting. Several major payments have been delayed or rerouted in the past week. Client funds that should have been processed through our standard channels were diverted to alternative accounts." My full attention snapped to her words. "How is that possible? Who authorized the changes?" "That's the problem. The authorizations appear legitimate on paper. They carry appropriate signatures and follow established protocols, but they weren't initiated through the normal department channels." Teresa placed a folder on my desk. "We're talking about approximately $7.2 million across 3 separate transactions." The implications were disturbing. Either we had a serious security breach, or someone with high-level access was deliberately interfering with Meridian's financial operations. "Where are the funds now?" I asked, scanning the documents she'd provided. "That's what prompted me to bring this directly to you. The money was transferred to holding accounts at First National, then immediately wired to a series of offshore entities. We're still trying to trace the complete paper trail." A cold certainty settled in my stomach. "Who has authorization for transfers of that size?" "Only C-suite executives and Richard as Executive VP of Global Development," Teresa confirmed. "Given recent events..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Richard was attempting to damage Meridian financially as leverage in his lawsuit. By creating cash flow issues and disrupting operations, he could point to deteriorating business conditions under my leadership. I reached for the phone. "We need to contact the FBI's Financial Crimes Division immediately. This goes beyond family." "Disagreement into potential criminal activity," Teresa nodded grimly. "I've already prepared the documentation they'll need." After initiating the federal investigation, I called an emergency meeting of the executive team, excluding those with known loyalty to Richard. The gathering was somber as I explained the situation. "Until we understand the full extent of these irregularities, we need to implement enhanced security protocols for all financial transactions," I concluded. "Every payment above $50,000 will require dual authentication, including my personal approval or Teresa's." Michael Chen, our Chief Technology Officer, leaned forward. "We should also conduct a complete audit of our network security. If someone is manipulating our financial systems, they might have access to other sensitive information as well." The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about money. The entire company's infrastructure might be compromised. "Implement whatever measures you deem necessary," I authorized. "Budget is not a constraint where security is concerned." As the meeting dispersed, James pulled me aside. "This changes the legal landscape significantly. If we can prove Richard is deliberately sabotaging Meridian operations, Judge Lancaster will take a very different view of his lawsuit. First, we need conclusive evidence linking him to the transfers," I cautioned. "He's too smart to leave an obvious trail." James nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's time to consider a more proactive approach." Before he could elaborate, my assistant appeared with an urgent message. A representative from Westridge Partners, one of Meridian's largest clients, was waiting in the reception area, demanding to speak with me immediately. Bradford Westridge was a third-generation construction magnate whose company had partnered with Meridian on major infrastructure projects for decades. His presence without an appointment signaled serious concerns. "Morgan," he greeted me tersely when I met him in the conference room. "What the hell is happening with the Powell Bridge project? My site manager just informed me that critical components scheduled for delivery yesterday never arrived, and your project lead is suddenly unreachable." My mind raced. The Powell Bridge was a $140 million contract that Richard had personally negotiated last year, a showcase project that had received priority status under his direction. "I apologize for the disruption, Brad," I responded, buying time while trying to recall the project details. "There's been no communication from our project team about delivery delays." "None," he confirmed, frustration evident. "We have 300 workers standing idle, specialized equipment rented at $30,000 per day sitting unused, and a completion penalty clause that kicks in next month. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's potentially catastrophic." I nodded, my suspicion growing that this was another aspect of Richard's sabotage strategy. "Let me investigate immediately. Who's your direct contact on our side?" "Edward Voss," Brad replied. "Been working with him for 6 months. Competent, responsive, until yesterday when he completely disappeared." Edward Voss, one of Richard's loyal lieutenants. The connection was impossible to ignore. "Brad, I give you my personal assurance that I'll resolve this situation today," I promised. "Would you be willing to wait while I gather my project team? I'd like you to present when we identify what's happened and implement solutions." He checked his watch reluctantly. "I can give you 1 hour. After that, I'll need to consider alternate arrangements." 1 hour to salvage a $140 million contract and a decades-long relationship. I immediately summoned the engineering and logistics teams, conspicuously excluding anyone with close ties to Richard. The room quickly filled with concerned managers trying to understand the situation. "The Powell Bridge components were completed ahead of schedule," reported Anita Singh, the production manager. "They were inspected, approved, and loaded for transport 5 days ago. According to our system, they should have arrived at the site yesterday morning. But, according to Westridge Partners, nothing was delivered," I clarified. "Where are 3 truckloads of specialized bridge components?" The team looked at each other in confusion until Marcus Weber, a veteran logistics coordinator, cleared his throat. "Ms. Blackwell, I just checked our tracking system. The shipment was rerouted 2 days ago to a storage facility in Riverside. The authorization came through the executive approval channel. It shows Mr. Voss signed off on the change." "On whose authority?" I demanded. Marcus hesitated. "The system shows Mr. Richard Blackwell as the authorizing executive. The stated reason was quality control review before final delivery." Bradford Westridge's expression darkened. "Quality control was completed weeks ago. The components passed every inspection." "And where is Edward Voss now?" I asked. "He requested emergency family leave yesterday morning," Marcus replied, checking his tablet. "Approved by Mr. Richard Blackwell. Directly." The pattern was unmistakable. Richard was systematically creating crises that would undermine client confidence and disrupt operations, all while maintaining plausible deniability. I turned to Bradford, not bothering to mask my anger at the situation. "Brad, I won't insult you with excuses. What's happened here is unacceptable. The components will be delivered to your site by tomorrow morning, with Meridian covering all standby costs you've incurred. Additionally, we'll extend the completion deadline by 1 week with no penalty triggers." He studied me skeptically. "That addresses the immediate problem, but what about the bigger issue? Is Meridian becoming unreliable? I'm hearing rumors about leadership disputes and operational problems." It was the opening I needed. "What you're witnessing is unfortunately the fallout from a family disagreement about Meridian's future. My grandfather appointed me to lead the company because he believed in my commitment to the values that have made our partnership successful for decades. Others are currently challenging that decision through tactics that, frankly, place business relationships at risk." I met his gaze directly. "I'm asking for your patience as we resolve these internal matters. The Meridian that your father and grandfather trusted remains fundamentally unchanged in its commitment to quality and integrity. What's changing is how aggressively we'll protect those values from compromise." Bradford considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I knew your grandfather for 30 years. He didn't suffer fools or play political games. If he chose you to lead Meridian, that carries significant weight with me. He extended his hand. You have 48 hours to demonstrate that this situation was an anomaly, not a new pattern. After Bradford departed and the crisis team dispersed to expedite the component delivery, I returned to my office to find James waiting, his expression grave. The FBI has preliminary findings on the financial transfers, he reported. The authentication. Credentials used belong to Gregory, not Richard. Your uncle is creating distance between himself and the most questionable activities. I sank into my chair, the weight of the day's discoveries settling heavily. He's systematically attacking Meridian from multiple angles: financial irregularities, client relationship sabotage, internal disruption, and he's using others as shields to maintain deniability. James nodded. Classic Richard. He's never been one to launch a frontal assault when a flanking maneuver is possible. We need to stop playing defense, I decided, my patience finally exhausted. It's time we showed Richard exactly who he's dealing with, and what happens when someone threatens what my grandfather built. The boardroom felt charged with tension as I entered precisely at 7:30 the next morning. I had called this emergency session with the full board of directors, including Richard and Gregory, citing urgent matters affecting company stability. The formal language had guaranteed attendance, with even my most skeptical directors recognizing the gravity of the situation. I had spent much of the night preparing with James, Teresa, and Michael Chen, assembling evidence and developing a strategy. That would leave no room for Richard to maneuver. This wasn't just about defending my position anymore. It was about protecting Meridian itself. Richard sat midway down the table, projecting casual confidence despite the early hour. Gregory looked less composed, his fingers drumming nervously on the polished wood. The other directors watched me with expressions ranging from concern to curiosity as I took my place at the head of the table. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, I began, my voice steady. Over the past 48 hours, Meridian has experienced a series of operational disruptions that demand immediate board attention. I nodded to Teresa, who distributed folders to each director. What you're receiving is documentation of 3 specific incidents: financial irregularities involving $7.2 million in diverted client payments, the deliberate delay of critical components for the Powell Bridge project resulting in contract violations, and unauthorized personnel changes affecting key client relationships. Richard's expression remained neutral, though I noticed his jaw tighten slightly. Gregory paled visibly as he scanned the contents of his folder. These aren't isolated events, I continued. They represent a coordinated attempt to undermine Meridian's operations and damage its reputation with clients. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division has opened an investigation into the fund transfers. Bradford Westridge personally visited yesterday regarding the Powell Bridge situation. And 3 other major clients have contacted me with concerns about sudden changes to their project teams. Howard Jeffries, our longest-serving independent director, looked up from the documentation with alarm. Are you suggesting these disruptions were deliberately orchestrated? By whom? I met his gaze directly. The evidence strongly indicates internal sabotage, Mr. Jeffries. Each incident involves authorization credentials belonging to either Richard or Gregory Blackwell, or executives with direct reporting relationships to them. The room erupted in murmurs as board members exchanged shocked glances. Richard finally broke his silence. This is absurd, he scoffed, though I detected an undercurrent of nervousness beneath his practiced indignation. Morgan is attempting to distract from her own incompetence by inventing conspiracy theories. These are ordinary operational issues, being dramatically overblown by someone with no experience managing a company of Meridian's complexity. Is the FBI investigation an invention, Richard? I asked calmly. Or the documented rerouting of bridge components that nearly cost us the Westridge contract? These aren't theories, they're facts supported by Meridian's own internal records. I turned to Michael Chen. Our Chief Technology Officer has completed a forensic analysis of the system authorizations involved in each incident. Mr. Chen, please share your findings with the board. Michael stood, his manner professional and detached as he walked the directors through the technical evidence. System logs showed Richard's credentials used to approve personnel changes that removed experienced project managers from key accounts. Email trails revealed Gregory's authorization of the financial transfers now under federal investigation. Digital signatures confirmed Richard's direct involvement in rerouting the Powell Bridge materials. In my professional assessment, Michael concluded, these actions cannot be attributed to system errors or miscommunication. They represent deliberate manipulation of Meridian's operational systems by individuals with high-level access. As Michael returned to his seat, I surveyed the board's reactions. Most appeared stunned by the evidence presented. A few, those with long-standing ties to Richard, looked uncomfortable but unconvinced. Richard leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he often used when negotiating difficult situations. Even if these operational issues exist exactly as described, attributing malicious intent is quite a leap. In the midst of a leadership transition, miscommunications and process breakdowns are inevitable. What Morgan lacks is the experience to distinguish between normal friction and imagined sabotage. It was precisely the response I had anticipated, deflecting responsibility while undermining my credibility. But I was prepared. I expected you might characterize the situation that way, I said, signaling to Teresa. She distributed a second set of documents to the board. What you're now receiving are transcripts of communications between Richard Blackwell, Gregory Blackwell, and several executives currently aligned with their interests. Gregory visibly flinched. Richard's expression hardened as he quickly scanned the pages. These messages, extracted from Meridian's secure servers during our security audit, explicitly discuss creating operational difficulties that would demonstrate the consequences of Williams' misguided decision. They reference specific actions to apply pressure through strategic disruptions until the board recognizes the need for experienced leadership. I let the implications sink in before continuing. Most damning is an exchange dated 3 days after the court denied the injunction request, in which Richard writes, "If legal channels won't correct this situation quickly enough, we'll demonstrate that Meridian cannot function under current leadership." The room fell completely silent. Even Richard's most loyal allies on the board appeared shaken by the evidence of deliberate sabotage. Howard Jeffries broke the silence, his voice tight with controlled anger. If these communications are authentic, they represent a profound breach of fiduciary duty to this company and its shareholders. They're taken out of context, Richard insisted, though his usual confidence had diminished considerably. Discussions about transition challenges have been deliberately mischaracterized to support Morgan's narrative. The full message threads are available for review, I responded. Nothing has been excerpted or altered. I then addressed the entire board directly. I didn't call this meeting merely to expose what's happened, but to resolve it definitively. Meridian cannot continue with leadership actively working to undermine its operations. Therefore, I am formally requesting board approval for the following actions. First, the immediate suspension of Richard and Gregory Blackwell from all operational roles pending completion of internal and external investigations. Second, board authorization to implement enhanced security protocols across all financial and operational systems. Third, establishment of a special committee to review all executive decisions made during the past 30 days to identify and correct any additional instances of sabotage. Richard surged to his feet. This is nothing short of a coup. You manipulate our father into changing his will, seize control of the company, and now fabricate evidence to purge those who challenge your authority. I won't stand for it. I remained seated, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well throughout this conflict. This isn't about authority, Richard. It's about accountability. You've spent weeks claiming I lack the experience to lead Meridian. Yet when faced with a leadership transition you didn't control, your response wasn't to support the company's stability. It was to deliberately damage operations to prove your point. I looked around the table at each director in turn. My grandfather believed that true leadership isn't demonstrated during easy times, but during challenges. The past weeks have certainly qualified as a challenge, not just for me personally, but for everyone at Meridian. How we respond now will determine whether my grandfather's legacy of integrity survives or is sacrificed to family pride. Howard Jeffries nodded slowly. I move that we vote on Ms. Blackwell's proposed actions immediately. I second the motion, added Diana Reeves, another independent director who had remained silent until now. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 8 directors supported the suspension of Richard and Gregory, with 3 opposing and 1 abstention. The other measures passed by similar margins. Throughout the process, Richard sat rigid with fury, while Gregory appeared increasingly resigned to their fate. As the meeting concluded, Richard approached me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "This isn't over, Morgan. Not by a long shot. You've won a skirmish, not the war." I met his gaze steadily. "That's where you're wrong, Uncle Richard. This was never a war to me. It was about protecting what Grandpa built, something you seem to have forgotten how to do." As he turned to leave, I added, "And Richard, clear your office by the end of the day. Security will be monitoring." The transformation in Meridian's atmosphere was almost immediate. With Richard and Gregory suspended and their key allies under scrutiny, the operational problems mysteriously ceased. The Powell Bridge. Components arrived at the construction site the same day. The diverted client payments were traced and recovered. Project teams stabilized as the disruption subsided. I worked 18-hour days, personally meeting with key clients to repair relationships and restore confidence. Most responded positively, particularly after learning about the circumstances behind the recent difficulties. Bradford Westridge, true to his word, extended our contract deadline and even hinted at future projects once the current situation stabilized completely. A week after the board meeting, Teresa found me in my office, long after most employees had gone home. "You need to see this," she said, placing a tablet in front of me. The screen showed a business news article with the headline, "Blackwell versus Blackwell. Richard and Gregory file new lawsuit against Meridian and Trust." I skimmed the article, unsurprised by this development. Having failed to undermine me operationally, my uncles were returning to legal channels, this time with claims of defamation, wrongful suspension, and corporate governance violations. "They're not giving up," Teresa observed, watching my reaction. "No," I agreed, "but neither am I." What Richard still didn't understand, what he had perhaps never understood about my grandfather, was that protecting Meridian wasn't about winning power struggles. It was about upholding principles, even when doing so came at personal cost. William Blackwell had built his company on integrity, innovation, and valuing people above short-term profits. I intended to lead it the same way, regardless of how many battles that required. As I watched the city lights from my grandfather's window, I felt his presence more strongly than at any time since his passing. The path forward remained challenging, but for the first time since discovering my family's betrayal, I was truly certain that I was the right person to walk it. 3 months after taking control of Meridian, I finally felt like I was finding my rhythm as CEO. The initial chaos had settled into a more manageable routine, though routine still meant 12-hour days and working through most weekends. Richard and Gregory's lawsuit continued to simmer in the background, with motions and counter-motions creating a steady stream of legal work, but the immediate threat to Meridian's operations had been neutralized. More importantly, I was beginning to implement my own vision for the company's future, one that honored my grandfather's principles while acknowledging the need for evolution in a rapidly changing industry. The research division that Richard had planned to gut was now receiving expanded funding, with a focus on sustainable engineering solutions. We had launched a mentorship program pairing experienced engineers with promising recruits from diverse backgrounds. And a comprehensive review of our international operations had revealed opportunities to improve both efficiency and ethical standards. I was reviewing the quarterly numbers with Teresa one Tuesday morning when my assistant interrupted with an unexpected message. "Ms. Blackwell, your cousin Ethan is here. He says it's urgent." Teresa raised an eyebrow. "Want me to stay?" I considered it briefly. "No, I'll handle this, but stay within shouting distance." She smiled grimly as she gathered her papers. "Always." Ethan entered cautiously, looking noticeably different from when I'd last seen him. The designer suits and carefully styled appearance had given way to more casual attire and visible fatigue around his eyes. "Morgan," he began, hovering awkwardly near the door. "Thanks for seeing me without an appointment." "What's so urgent, Ethan?" I motioned him to a chair, maintaining a professional distance. While he had warned me about Richard's initial plans, months ago, his loyalties remained uncertain. He sat, fidgeting with his watch, that childhood habit persisting into adulthood. "I'm here because I think you should know that Dad and Uncle Richard are planning something new. Something bigger than lawsuits or operational sabotage." My guard instantly went up. "And you're telling me this because it's crossed a line," he said, leaning forward. "They're not just trying to regain control anymore. They're willing to destroy Meridian's reputation to force you out." "Be specific," I pressed. Ethan took a deep breath. "They've hired Burke Strategic Consulting. They specialize in corporate smear campaigns disguised as investigative journalism. The plan is to plant stories questioning Meridian's financial stability, engineering standards, and ethical practices under your leadership." I kept my expression neutral, despite the sinking feeling in my stomach. Burke Strategic had a notorious reputation for ruthlessly effective character assassination campaigns that technically fell just within legal boundaries. "How? Do you know this?" "I was there when they met with Jackson Burke yesterday. Dad didn't want me involved, but Uncle Richard insisted that all family members needed to present a united front going forward." Ethan's gaze dropped to his hands. "When Burke started outlining methods for undermining client confidence and triggering regulatory investigations, I realized this had gone too far." I studied my cousin carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why draw the line here, Ethan? You've stood by while they filed lawsuits and attempted to sabotage operations." "Because this isn't just about who controls Meridian anymore," he replied, meeting my eyes directly. "This is about potentially destroying a company that employs thousands of people, including me." He shook his head. "I've spent 8 years building the European division. Whatever happens between you and Dad and Uncle Richard, those employees don't deserve to become collateral damage." His reasoning was self-interested but logical, making it more credible than a sudden attack of conscience would have been. "What exactly are they planning to allege?" "Safety violations on the Powell Bridge project, financial irregularities in the Asian markets, ironic considering what they attempted themselves, and," he hesitated, "personal attacks suggesting you secured Grandpa's favor through manipulation during his illness." The last accusation stung most sharply, tainting the genuine relationship I'd had with my grandfather. Do they have any actual evidence for these claims, or are they manufacturing everything? They're distorting fragments of truth. There was a materials substitution on the Powell Bridge project, approved through proper channels for valid engineering reasons, but they're framing it as a cost-cutting measure that compromised structural integrity. The Asian market finances are complex enough that selective reporting can create misleading impressions. And as for the personal allegations, he shrugged uncomfortably. They're planning to use the fact that you spent more time with Grandpa in his final months than anyone else. I absorbed this information, anger building beneath my composed exterior. This new attack was more insidious than previous attempts, harder to defend against because it would play out in public perception rather than courts or boardrooms. When is this supposed to begin? They're fast-tracking it, Ethan replied. First, stories could appear within days. Burke promises maximum impact before the quarterly shareholder meeting. The timing was strategic. The upcoming shareholder meeting was crucial for securing support for my long-term vision for Meridian. If confidence was undermined before then, Richard might find leverage to force board changes or other concessions. "Why are you really here, Ethan?" I asked directly. "What do you want in exchange for this information?" He seemed almost relieved at the question. "Protection from the fallout. When this blows back on Dad and Uncle Richard, and it will, I don't want my career caught in the crossfire. I've worked too hard building my division to lose everything over their vendetta." At least he was honest about his motives. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Operational autonomy for the European division, reporting directly to you instead of through the standard management structure. And your word that when the dust settles, my position remains secure regardless of what happens to Dad and Uncle Richard." I considered his request carefully. Ethan had always been the most competent of my cousins, whatever his other flaws. The European division had indeed flourished under his leadership. "If your information proves accurate and complete, I'll consider your proposal," I said finally. "But Ethan, if this is another play, if you're feeding me partial information while holding back crucial details, there won't be a second chance." He nodded, apparently satisfied with the conditional agreement. "There's one more thing you should know. Burke specializes in manufacturing crises that force targets to make mistakes. They want you to react emotionally, to make defensive decisions that create real problems they can then expose." It was a sophisticated strategy, and exactly the kind of approach Richard would favor. Create enough smoke that people assume fire, then use the target's panicked response to start an actual blaze. After Ethan left, I immediately called James, Teresa, and Michael Chen to my office. The situation demanded a coordinated response from Meridian's core leadership team. "Let me understand this correctly," James said after I explained Ethan's warning. "Richard and Gregory have hired professional character assassins to plant false stories about Meridian and you personally?" "That's the essence of it," I confirmed. "The question is how to respond." Teresa looked troubled. "Preemptive statements often backfire in these situations. Denying allegations before they're publicly made can actually lend them credibility." Michael nodded in agreement. "And addressing specific claims directly can amplify their reach. People who might never have seen the original stories hear about them through our responses." They were right, but doing nothing wasn't an option either. Richard was forcing me into a defensive position where any reaction could be weaponized against me. What would my grandfather do in this situation? I wondered aloud. James smiled slightly. William had a favorite saying for circumstances like these. When they go low, go higher, but bring a spotlight. The phrase triggered a memory of my grandfather dealing with a competitor's smear campaign years ago. Rather than engaging directly with the allegations, he had elevated the conversation entirely, using the attention to showcase Meridian's values and contributions to the community. "That's it," I said, an approach crystallizing in my mind. "We don't play defense at all. We change the game completely." Over the next several hours, we developed a strategy that would not only neutralize Richard's attack, but potentially transform it into an opportunity. By the time my team departed that evening, our plan was in motion, a plan that Richard, with all his experience in corporate warfare, would never anticipate. Because while Richard was still fighting for control of Meridian, I had already moved beyond that limited vision to something more meaningful, redefining what Meridian could become. The company my grandfather had built deserved better than to be a battlefield for family grievances. It deserved to be a legacy that continued to improve lives long after all of us were gone. As I prepared to leave the office well past midnight, I paused before the portrait of my grandfather that hung in the executive suite. "I hope I'm getting this right," I said softly to his painted image. The wise eyes seemed to twinkle with their familiar combination of shrewdness and kindness, and I could almost hear his voice. "Trust yourself, Morgan. I always did." The morning of the quarterly shareholder meeting arrived with the first hint of autumn crispness in the air. I stood at my office window, watching the city wake up as I mentally rehearsed the presentation that would either secure my future at Meridian or leave the company vulnerable to Richard's machinations. The past. Week had unfolded exactly as Ethan predicted. 3 separate business publications had run investigative pieces questioning Meridian's project safety standards, financial reporting practices, and leadership transition. The articles carefully avoided direct libel while painting a concerning picture through selective facts and anonymous sources. Social media had amplified the allegations, and several clients had called seeking reassurance about their projects. But rather than scrambling to defend against each accusation, we had implemented our alternative strategy. Meridian had announced a comprehensive transparency initiative, inviting independent engineering experts to review our major projects, including Powell Bridge. We had voluntarily engaged a respected accounting firm to conduct an extraordinary audit of our financial practices. And most surprisingly to outside observers, we had accelerated several innovative initiatives that directly addressed industry challenges. The response had caught Richard off guard. Instead of appearing defensive or panicked, Meridian projected confidence and a commitment to excellence that resonated with clients and shareholders alike. The transparency measures had quickly disproven the most serious allegations, while the positive announcements had shifted media attention toward Meridian's future rather than manufactured controversies. "It's time," Teresa said, appearing at my office door. She handed me a tablet showing the latest share price, up nearly 4% in pre-meeting trading, a strong vote of confidence. I nodded, gathering my materials. "Is everyone in position?" "Exactly as planned," she confirmed with a small smile. The grand ballroom of the Westmont Hotel had been transformed for the shareholder meeting, with Meridian's distinctive logo prominently displayed behind the stage. Nearly 300 people filled the space: major investors, board members, financial analysts, and media representatives. I spotted Richard and Gregory in the front row, their expressions a mixture of confidence and wariness. Howard Jeffries, as board chairman, opened the proceedings with standard formalities before introducing me. The applause was polite but reserved as I took the podium, a room full of people waiting to be convinced. "6 months ago," I began, "I became CEO of Meridian Enterprises under unusual and challenging circumstances. Today, I want to speak candidly about where Meridian stands now and the path we're forging for the future." For the next 20 minutes, I presented a comprehensive overview of the company's performance, the areas where we had succeeded, the challenges we still faced, and the strategic initiatives underway to address them. I acknowledged the recent controversies directly but briefly, focusing instead on the concrete actions we had taken to ensure transparency and accountability. "But today isn't just about reviewing our progress," I continued, sensing the room's growing engagement. "It's about revealing Meridian's next chapter, a vision my grandfather began formulating in his final months and entrusted me to implement." The massive screen behind me, images appeared of a revolutionary infrastructure project in developing communities that would provide sustainable water and power systems at significantly reduced costs. The Horizon Initiative, I announced, represents Meridian's most ambitious undertaking to date. Using breakthrough technologies developed in our research division, the same division some had deemed expendable, we will revolutionize essential infrastructure for communities globally while establishing new industry standards for sustainability and efficiency. Murmurs spread through the audience as I outlined the project's scope, already secured partnerships, and projected impact. Financial analysts in attendance began rapidly typing notes as they calculated the potential returns. This initiative would not exist without my grandfather's insistence on maintaining robust research and development, despite pressure to focus exclusively on immediate profits. His foresight created the foundation for what will become Meridian's defining achievement over the next decade. I paused, allowing my gaze to fall deliberately on Richard and Gregory. Leadership isn't about preserving the status quo or maximizing short-term returns. It's about honoring the past while building for the future. It's about recognizing that a company's greatest asset isn't its current balance sheet, but its capacity for principled innovation. The room had gone completely still, all attention focused on the compelling vision taking shape before them. 3 days ago, we received conditional approval for the patents underlying the Horizon systems, I revealed. Conservative projections indicate these technologies will generate $420 million in licensing revenue over the next 5 years, in addition to the direct project contracts currently being finalized. Excited whispers rippled through the financial analysts present. Such projections would significantly impact Meridian's valuation and share price. But perhaps most meaningful is what happens next, I continued, nodding to Teresa, who activated the final presentation slides. Effective immediately, Meridian is establishing the William Blackwell Foundation, which will receive 10% of all Horizon Initiative revenues to fund engineering education for students from underserved communities. The announcement drew spontaneous applause, led by several longtime board members who had known my grandfather well. Even some of Richard's traditional allies appeared impressed by the comprehensive vision. My grandfather understood that Meridian's true legacy wouldn't be measured in buildings constructed or profits generated, but in lives improved and opportunities created. The Horizon Initiative and Foundation honor that understanding while positioning Meridian at the forefront of our industry's future. As I concluded the presentation and opened the floor for questions, the energy in the room had transformed. Shareholders, who had arrived concerned about recent controversies, were now engaged with Meridian's compelling future. Financial analysts were rapidly recalculating projections based on the Horizon Initiative's potential. And Richard and Gregory sat stone-faced, their smear campaign strategy thoroughly overshadowed by the positive vision I had presented. The Q&A session ran long, with questions focused primarily on the Horizon technologies and implementation timeline rather than the manufactured controversies of recent weeks. When the formal meeting concluded, I found myself surrounded by shareholders and board members offering congratulations and support. James appeared at my elbow as the crowd finally thinned. "Extraordinary presentation," he said quietly. William would have been incredibly proud. "Thank you," I replied, the emotion of the moment finally catching up to me. "I think we've turned a corner." "More than that," James nodded toward the exit, where Richard and Gregory could be seen in animated conversation with several board members. Their gestures suggested frustration rather than triumph. I suspect their proxy fight was effectively over before it officially began. The shareholder support they were counting on has evaporated. He was right. By the following morning, Meridian's stock had jumped nearly 12% on enthusiasm for the Horizon Initiative. Financial analysts issued glowing assessments of the company's direction and leadership. And most telling, 3 board members previously aligned with Richard publicly endorsed my vision in interviews with business publications. 2 weeks later, Richard and Gregory voluntarily dismissed their lawsuit, citing a desire to move forward productively rather than continue legal proceedings. Both accepted generous severance packages in exchange for their remaining shares and non-competition agreements. Ethan, true to his opportunistic nature, had positioned himself carefully throughout the final confrontation. Having provided the critical warning about Burke Strategic's plan, he had earned the operational autonomy he requested for the European division. His performance since then had been exemplary, suggesting he might eventually grow into a leader worthy of the Blackwell name. 6 months after the shareholder meeting, I stood in my grandfather's study at the Blackwell estate, my estate now, though I rarely spent time there. I had come to retrieve something special for the dedication ceremony of the William Blackwell Foundation's first scholarship recipients. The leather portfolio my grandfather had used throughout his career sat on his desk, preserved exactly as he had left it. Inside, I found what I was seeking: the fountain pen he had used to sign every major Meridian contract for 60 years. It would now sign the Foundation's first scholarship certificates, continuing his legacy in a fitting new way. As I closed the portfolio, my gaze fell on the family photograph that had always held prominence on his desk. A picture from my college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. I picked it up, remembering that day clearly. He had whispered something as the photographer captured the moment, words I had almost forgotten until now. Remember, Morgan, build something that matters more than money or power. Build something that lasts. Looking back at the tumultuous journey of the past year, I realized that was exactly what I had done. Meridian was thriving, not just as a profitable enterprise, but as a force for positive change. The family conflict had been painful, but perhaps necessary, burning away what was superficial to reveal what truly mattered. I placed the photograph carefully in my bag alongside the fountain pen. My grandfather had seen something in me that I hadn't fully recognized in myself until tested by fire. Not just the ability to fight for what was rightfully mine, but the vision to transform it into something greater than any of us had imagined. The woman who had been excluded from the will reading, who had discovered with shock that she already owned her grandfather's company, had evolved into a leader worthy of his legacy. And in that transformation lay the most meaningful inheritance of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And, hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.